We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast was recorded, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Welcome to the podcast series of Raising the Bar Melbourne, curated by the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne. This special health edition of Raising the Bar, held in May of 2026, featured 20 talks by some of Melbourne's leading healthcare experts and was held across 10 pubs and bars, all in one night. The speakers presented topics ranging from AI and cancer research to understanding ADHD and neurodiversity, helping kids sleep, healthy social media habits, the future of robotic surgery, and much more. In this episode, you'll hear Associate Professor Laura Hart talk about how adults can recognise and respond to children's mental health challenges and support them without stigma or harm.
Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here tonight. It's amazing to be at this event. Thanks to your team, Ellie, for putting on such a show. It's so exciting to be outside of the regular scientific conference context and to be presenting in this very different atmosphere. To begin, I would like to also extend my acknowledgements and respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet tonight, and also to recognise those with lived experience who join us here this evening. Lived experience is a critical part of what we do in mental health research, so we acknowledge the incredible role that it plays and that those who come to us with lived experience either of mental health problems or caregiving for young people with mental health problems, what they bring. So I'm following notes on my phone so I don't get distracted and just start talking gibberish. So hopefully I can continue to make sense. The research that I'm going to be talking about tonight is definitely a group effort. Sitting behind what I am talking about are many, many people. I just get the privilege of talking about it, but it's definitely not only my research. So it's important to acknowledge that lots of people, some of whom are here tonight, have been involved in this research. I have split this talk into 4 parts. The first part is about how we might define mental health problems in children. And when I talk about children and childhood, I'm really focusing on the primary school years, so those aged 5 to 12. And we're not really touching on secondary school students or adolescents much at all. In part 2, I'm going to talk about 2 essential concepts that are really important for adults who want to help children with their mental health. And these are the mental health continuum and mental health literacy. In part 3, I'm going to talk about some possible harms that might come from raising awareness and putting a focus on child mental health and how we might avoid these. And then finish off with some practical strategies for those who want to help children with their mental health. And as Ali said, there'll be a Q&A component at the end. So you're welcome to note down any questions as they come up or just ask them from the floor when we open. So on to part 1, but before I get into talking about my research, I first want to read you a couple of stories about a child called Sammy. The first story is about a child called Sammy A, and the second story is about a child called Sammy B. And these are really creatively titled, I know. After I've read the 2 stories, I'm going to ask you which one you think might be having a problem with their mental health, okay? Sammy A is a 6-year-old who lives with mum, dad, and a brother. Sammy happily attends school and has a group of good friends. When Sammy spends time away from mum, Sammy can occasionally get worried about mum being hurt in an accident, like in a car crash. But Sammy still enjoys having playdates at other children's houses. Sammy very rarely complains of stomach aches. So that's Sammy A, and now I'm going to read out Sammy B's story. Sammy B is also a 6-year-old who lives with mum, dad, and a brother. Sammy has been refusing to go to school because of feeling scared when away from mum. Sammy worries constantly that mum will be hurt in an accident like a car crash. Sammy refuses to play at other children's houses if mum is not there, and has frequent nightmares and often complains of stomach aches and headaches. Sammy is falling behind at school and finding it difficult to keep friendships. Now, I'd like you to raise your hand who thought Sammy A, the first story, was experiencing a problem with her mental health. Just for the podcast, that's no one. And who thinks Sammy B is experiencing a mental health problem? Excellent. So most of us in the room. Thank you. And in fact, research tells us that adults are pretty good at being able to distinguish between a child who is having no symptoms or very few symptoms and a child who has very clear symptoms of a mental health problem. We're pretty good at picking up on, is there a problem or isn't there? But exactly what the problem is, we're not so good at. I'm now going to move on to talking about two more children, interestingly named Sammy C and Sammy D. Sammy C, funnily enough, is also a 6-year-old who lives with mum, dad, and a brother. Sammy attends school and has trouble keeping friends because of often spending time in the sick bay during recess and lunch due to stomach aches and headaches. Sammy doesn't like going to play dates at other children's houses, especially if mum cannot be there. Sammy worries a lot about mum being hurt in an accident, like a car crash, so Sammy often asks to call mum when at school. And now we're going to hear about Sammy D. Sammy D is also a 6-year-old living with mum, dad, and a brother. Sammy attends school and has a good group of friends. Sammy sometimes complains of stomach aches or headaches at school, but most of the time can go back to class after some rest time in sick bay. When Sammy spends time away from mum, Sammy can get worried about mum being hurt in an accident like a car crash. But Sammy still goes on to play dates at other children's houses, even when feeling worried. Show of hands, please, if you think Sammy C, the first story, is having worse problems with their mental health compared to Sammy D. So Sammy C, who thinks, maybe about half. And Sammy D, who thinks Sammy D is having worse? No, it was definitely Sammy C. Well done. What we find out in research is actually that adults tend to have a lot more difficulty telling the difference between mild and moderate symptoms. And that was the difference between Sammy C and Sammy D, that we can see there are symptoms there, but for one of them, it's much more getting in the way of their functioning than it is for the other. Let's unpack the differences between Sammy C and Sammy D. So both are going to school. Both are experiencing worries. Both are having stomach aches and headaches. But for Sammy C, these worries are getting in the way of friendships. Sammy C's not coming back from sick bay, and it's impacting on schoolwork and probably impacting on Sammy's mum too, who has to be there for all the play dates. Although Sammy D is also experiencing this separation anxiety, it's not getting in the way to the same extent. They're still able to go back to the classroom after having a break. They're still going on play dates, even though they're worried about what's happening to mum. So the level of impact on functioning is different. So let's take a step back and look at how do we define a mental health problem and how do we define mental health then? So our mental health is made up of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviours, and the relationship between these three and how it impacts on our functioning. We can have good mental health or we can have poor mental health or mental ill health. And the World Health Organization defines good mental health as a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn and work well, and contribute to their community. It has intrinsic and instrumental value and is a basic human right. So good mental health is much more than just the absence of illness. Much like having really good physical health, it's about more than just not being unwell. The WHO also defines a mental health problem as a mental state that is associated with significant distress, impairment in functioning, and increased risk of self-harm. Now that's related to adults, and when we're talking about children and we're talking about impact on functioning, we are thinking about where they live, learn and play. So are they getting along in their routines and chores at home? Are they learning at school and making academic progress? Are they able to play in the playground with peers, or are they making headway in social relationships when they are getting into trouble? Defining mental health in children, though, is a little bit more complex than in adults because it's not only just about functioning and whether our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours are impacting on day-to-day functioning. It's also about, is it impacting on development? Because what we expect of a child where they're living, learning and playing at 5 is very different to what we expect of a child at 12. And we want them to be meeting those increased expectations over time without their mental health getting in the way. So my colleagues, the wonderful Dr. Claire Kelly, who's with us here tonight, and a wonderful colleague of ours, Professor Tony Jorm, who's not with us, but is a wonderful mentor and supervisor that we've been working with for a really long time. For the past 6 years, we've been working on child mental health research. Can you believe it? It's been that long. And we came up with some definitions to describe what it is that we're hoping adults are going to understand about children's mental health and how to recognise a mental health problem. So we have defined child mental health as their thoughts, feelings, and behaviours and how these impact on their development, relationships with others, daily activities, and learning. And we've defined a mental health problem as when a child's thoughts, feelings, or behaviours make it difficult for them to participate in everyday activities and to have the relationships expected of their age. Now, this is quite wordy. I know, I'm known for being quite wordy, but I challenge you to try and make it more succinct when you're dealing with such a complex issue. We really tore our hair out about trying to get this down. And at least we didn't say it's just the difference between SAMI C and SAMI D, right? Like we put some effort into it. But back to SAMI. So the differences between SAMI is A through to D is that they're all experiencing these symptoms of anxiety, but the level of impact that it's having is different. The severity of the symptoms are different and the way it's impacting on them are different. And this is the defining key. This is how we know whether there's a mental health problem or not. Now, before I move on to the concepts that I'm going to talk about in part 2, I just want to quickly note a couple of things about diagnoses. So there are some labels when it comes to child mental health that you might hear, and these are important sometimes, but we don't necessarily encourage adults to focus on diagnoses much. And I certainly think that when you're trying to help a child with their mental health, you don't need to focus on, is this a diagnosis or is it not? But just so you know, about 1 in 7 children in any 12-month period, so if we take a primary school classroom of 21 students in any one academic year, 3 of them are going to have symptoms that meet a diagnosis of a mental health problem, mental illness. And ADHD and anxiety disorders like separation anxiety that we saw in Sammy's stories are the most commonly diagnosed in 5 to 12-year-olds. So on to part 2 and the essential concepts of mental health literacy and the mental health continuum. So although I just defined mental health problem versus good mental health, actually mental health is much more complex than that. And it lies on a continuum or a spectrum where we have severity of symptoms in between good mental health at one end and mental ill health at the other. And the WHO, the font of all knowledge when it comes to things health, says that mental health exists on a complex continuum, which is experienced differently from one person to the next. Now, Tony Jorm and I consulted on a Delphi study with Professor Frank Oberklade from Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And we were looking to try and come up with a tool that adults could use to talk about children's mental health. Because what we found was that educators and health professionals and parents all tend to use very different language when they're talking about child mental health. And often we don't understand what each other are saying because our labels are different. And that creates real issues for trying to explore how can we better help children when they're struggling. So the idea of a continuum was to have labels that everyone could use that are non-stigmatizing and nice and clear. So we did this Delphi study where we get together different groups and ask them to agree. And we had 296 participants from around Australia. There were groups of teachers, there were parents and carers and guardians, and then there were health professionals. And they all agreed that a tool that adults can use to talk about child mental health should have 4 points on this continuum, and it should be labelled good at one end, coping, struggling, and overwhelmed. And what we found was that good mental health means low or no symptoms. And for us, that was SAMI A that was described in the very first story. whereas coping is mild symptoms. There's not functioning being impacted, and this was SAMI D. Struggling is where there's moderate symptoms and probably a diagnosable illness, and this was SAMI C. And overwhelmed is when there is definitely a diagnosable illness with severe symptoms, high distress and risk of harm, and this was SAMI B. So now I want to turn to quickly talking about staging of illness, because this is a reason why thinking about a mental health continuum is really important. So I would assume that a lot of people will have heard of the stages of cancer, where we talk about stage 1 through to stage 4. And the idea is that if you pick up cancer early at stage 1, the interventions and treatments that you need are much less complex, much less invasive, and time to recovery is much shorter than if it's picked up at stage 3 or stage 4. Now, I'm not saying that mental health and cancer are the same. I'm just saying that with a mental health continuum, we can also think about trying to map the kinds of supports and interventions that a child might need onto the severity of the symptoms. So a child at the overwhelmed end is going to need a different level of support and intervention with different levels of complexity to a child who is coping and has milder symptoms. So it's a nice way of us thinking about matching severity to support. Importantly, not every child who shows symptoms of a mental health problem is going to need professional mental health. And we can see that by looking at the continuum. It's also true that with the right supports, that impact on functioning can be reduced, and children can move back up the continuum towards coping or good mental health. But if they're experiencing distress or stressful life events and they don't have the right supports, they can also move down the continuum as well. So it's not static, it's not fixed. I now want to turn to talking about mental health literacy, and this is a really important concept. And again, we come back to Tony Jorm because he's so influential in this space, and he defined the term in 1997 with his colleagues as the knowledge and beliefs about mental disorders that aid their recognition, management, or prevention. So really important understanding of mental health problems. And research suggests that when we have higher mental health literacy, we're more likely to recognise a mental health problem in ourselves and to seek appropriate help for it. But we're also more likely to recognise a mental health problem in the people around us and to suggest that they seek appropriate help too. So there are benefits to increasing our mental health literacy. It allows us to take better care of our mental health and the mental health of those around us. And so a team that I've been working with has come up with this idea of mental health literacy for supporting children. And this is adults' knowledge and beliefs that allow them to take action to support child mental health. So it's about action to prevent or manage mental health problems in children. It's adults' knowledge. It's not children's knowledge of their own mental health. So it's different to adults' mental health literacy about their own mental health. It's how adults can support kids. And it has 3 different components. First, the knowledge and attitudes that allow adults to understand mental health in childhood, recognizing when a child is developing a mental health problem, and the ability to communicate about the child's mental health in both a developmentally appropriate way with the child and in a non-stigmatizing and collaborative way with the caregivers who take care of the child that you might be concerned about. So it's much more complex when we're talking about adults helping children than it is adult to adult mental health. And the concept's been really important in guiding our development of what we've called the Supporting Child Mental Health Program, which is training adults who live or work with children how to pick up on mental health problems and support children with their mental health. I'm going to turn now to potential harms and how we might avoid these. There's a scholar in the UK called Lucy Fulks, and she's been very critical of mental health awareness campaigns and mental health literacy because she says there are harms that can come from increasing awareness and increasing a focus on mental health problems. And she has a range of critiques, but there are 2 that I think are particularly important that I'm going to touch on. One is what she calls the treatment gap. And she says that if we increase awareness of mental health problems, then people who recognize they have symptoms are going to go and seek help for them. But if we don't have enough specialists and enough treatment facilities available to these people, they're going to end up more distressed because they sit on waiting lists and they don't get the help that they need. So increasing awareness is bad because we increase distress. But I think if we go back to our original definition of mental health literacy, it's not just about recognizing mental health problems, it's also about the knowledge and beliefs that aid their management or prevention. So it also includes the ability to use evidence-based self-help strategies. And these are really important. And with the explosion in digital health interventions, there are huge amounts that we can do either as adults helping young people or for ourselves that don't need a mental health professional. That doesn't mean we wouldn't benefit from one, but if we're stuck on a waiting list, there are certainly things we can do to support our mental health. So I don't agree with the notion that increasing awareness increases a treatment gap and that's a bad thing. The other critique that Lucy Fulks has is that it can lead to over-pathologizing. So when there's lots of awareness about a mental health problem, people can start to identify with the symptoms. And if they identify with symptoms, then they can start to identify with an illness, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where people actually begin to experience mental health problems because they recognize it in themselves, when in fact they are reacting to normal but difficult life experiences. And we see this a lot on social media with young people, where there's a lot of, it's almost trendy to identify as having a mental health problem, or there's lots of sort of 3 symptom quizzes of what kind of depression do you have. It's often quite removed from the evidence-based diagnostic categories. And we can see that there is increases in distress when there are increases in identification with mental health diagnoses. But I think when we're adults supporting children, there are ways that we can increase awareness that don't end up in over-pathologization. So I also reject this notion, but I do it gently because I do agree that this could lead to harm. And the key here, I think, is about building emotional literacy for children instead of building children's own mental health literacy. It's a slight difference. What we don't want to do is to put a mental health continuum in front of kids and to say, whenever you feel overwhelmed, let me know that's a problem. Because everyone's going to feel overwhelmed at some point in their life. And we don't want children to think that if they ever have an experience of being overwhelmed, that they have a mental health problem and they've got that for life. Mental health is actually quite an abstract and difficult concept to understand. It requires thoughts, feelings, and behaviours creating impairment over time in multiple different settings. And kids, especially in the younger primary school years, can't grasp all of that at once. But what they can grasp is their moment-to-moment emotional experiences and how they translate into behaviours or reactions that may be problematic or not. So emotional literacy is helping children be able to name what emotion they're experiencing and to develop skills and strategies that help them manage their reactions so that they're not negatively impacting on themselves or others around them. And we know from research that this is a really helpful way to help children's mental health, and that when adults have better emotional literacy and better emotion regulation, they not only have better mental well-being, but their children have better mental health as well. So the key here is, for kids, we don't want to be increasing mental health literacy necessarily. We want to be improving emotional literacy. And mental health literacy for supporting children is for adults, and we definitely want to be increasing that. I want to touch on one sad story about over-pathologization, because I do agree that we could be creating harm, and this is one case study. Now, I want to talk about pediatric bipolar disorder. So bipolar is when you experience episodes of depression, so low mood, low energy, and then it's followed by episodes of mania, where you have very inflated mood, thoughts of grandiosity, lots of energy, and it can be associated with psychosis, where you lose touch with reality. And for adults experiencing bipolar, they tend to cycle from one mood extreme to another in a matter of days, often weeks and months. Between the 1920s and 1980s, researchers followed people with bipolar disorder and found that a very small subset of them experienced their first episode probably in the years between 10 to 15, and that typically bipolar begins with an episode of depression. And for a teeny tiny, less than 0.5% of people with bipolar, they were able to pinpoint their first episode happening before the age of 10. And in the 1990s, American psychiatrists came up with this idea that, well, maybe we could diagnose pediatric bipolar disorder, but maybe it looks different in kids to what it does in adults. And they came up with this idea that in children, you have ultra rapid cycling. So you can move from low mood, depressive episode to mania, high inflated mood within a matter of hours. And that in children, bipolar was actually chronic irritability rather than psychotic illness. Now, I don't know if you've ever known a chronically irritable child, but I wouldn't want them diagnosed with bipolar necessarily. So this became a real issue, and all of a sudden we see an explosion in diagnoses in America after the 1990s and very heavy medications being prescribed to these children, antipsychotics. And long-term, more recent studies have shown that people who were diagnosed with bipolar as children were not more likely to have adult bipolar disorder. They were actually more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or have had childhood trauma. And when they were treated with antipsychotics as kids, their mental health was not better as adults. So the research really suggests that these are not the same condition. It is not that it's early onset in childhood and then it's just moving on to a psychotic-like illness in adulthood, but actually probably chronic irritability is not the same as adult bipolar disorder. And so this is a case of not particularly evidence-based issues creeping in. And I want to quote from an Australian researcher who wrote a 2022 paper about this controversy. And he says, it's Michael Connors from Australia. He says, particular features of the US healthcare system may also contribute to the pediatric bipolar diagnosis, including diagnostic upcoding, whereby more serious diagnoses attract a greater amount of insurance reimbursement, thereby incentivizing them. The diagnosis, moreover, provides a large potential market for the pharmaceutical industry. So when adults begin to focus on what is wrong with the child and how can we make money from it, that's when we end up with overpathologization. But if we come back to our mental health continuum, and if adults can focus on how can I help, where are the impacts, what support does this child need, I think the chances of overpathologizing are really, really minimal. All right, so on to our final part. Practical strategies. So to recap, how am I going for time, Ellie? Good. Okay. To recap, we can define mental health problems in primary school children as when thoughts, feelings, and behaviours are impacting on functioning, getting in the way of development and causing distress. We can think about mental health as lying on a continuum or a spectrum with levels of symptoms that vary from no impact through to severe impact, with good mental health at one end through coping, struggling, and overwhelmed at the other. Mental health problems at the struggling and overwhelm end could probably benefit from professional mental health, but not everyone who experiences symptoms is going to need a mental health professional. And I'm certainly not anti-medication. Medication can be really important and very beneficial for some children, especially those who are at the struggling and overwhelmed ends. So professional help can include developing the mental health literacy for supporting children among adults, but also developing emotional literacy and those emotion regulation skills for children and the adults who care for them. Supporting a child with their mental health doesn't always have to involve seeking professional help, because there are lots of evidence-based ways in which we can use self-help strategies to support children. And in our Supporting Child Mental Health program, we talk about 5 levels of appropriate help and how they map onto the mental health continuum. So it doesn't always need to be a professional. It doesn't always need to be a diagnosis, but we can step in different ways at different levels of intensity to help. There are further resources, so there's some handouts scattered around the room. There is access to our Supporting Child Mental Health program at the moment, so if you want more information about that, we're doing an evaluation study. There's some QR codes or a URL you can take a look at. But there are other free evidence-based resources there for you too. For parents, there is the Growing Minds check-in. For educators, the BU website has an amazing array of resources. And for adults who work with kids in either their health setting or social services, Emerging Minds has an incredible array of resources for you. So something for everyone. So in summary, do little minds need big help? Well, I think the answer, much like mental health, is complex. It depends. It depends on where the child sits on the continuum. It depends on how much their functioning is being impacted. Adults can help by recognising when a child's thoughts, feelings and behaviours are getting in the way of where they live, learn and play, are getting in the way of their development or causing distress. And when this is happening, adults stepping in is really important, no matter where the child is sitting on the continuum. Whether a child can be supported with just self-help strategies or they might require professional help will depend on the level of impact and where they're sitting on the continuum. But no matter how overwhelmed a child is, big people can always play an important role in helping them to master their minds and begin to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if you could give us, I know it's general, but a bit of an idea about the development of the self-conscious of the child with which you can work to try and improve the child making the strategy adjustments to cope with their actual difficulty.
Thank you. Great question. Self-concept develops over time, and it's not what we call categorical, where one day you wake up and you're aware that you're there and the day before you weren't. It happens over time, and as children age, their self-concept becomes more and more complex and more abstract. I can talk about body image as one of the areas in which self-concept develops, because that's one of the areas where I've spent the most time researching, I'd say. And we know that children as preschoolers have wonderful, positive body image. They tend to say, I love my appearance, I'm great. And when they get to 7 or 8, they start at primary school and they start to become a little bit more self-conscious of their appearance. And once they hit puberty, it's all downhill. And it's very normative for adolescent children to become very aware that they do or don't look like their peers and to be a little bit more concerned about, their appearance. So there are that's quite an abstract concept, because you not only have to understand what your body looks like, but you have to understand what other people are seeing when they look at you, and then the social judgments that are overlaid with that perception. And that develops over time. That's quite an abstract process, and it requires abstract reasoning that develops later in childhood. If we can bring it back to sort of general mental health, I'd say we can, even in toddlers, develop emotional literacy. Now, they might not be able to say, they're having a tantrum, and they might not be able to say, I feel exhausted, so I'm just overwhelmed. They don't have that level of self-concept. But as adults who are helping them, we can say, I can see you're really tired, and the reason that you want the blue sippy cup instead of the pink sippy cup is actually because you haven't had a sleep today. And so we can increase their emotional literacy even without that self-concept needing to be there, and it becomes more developed and more concrete as they grow up. And I would say that once we're getting to adolescence, it's okay to start to talk about more complex concepts like feeling sad over a longer period of time in a way that's getting in the way of friendships, or if they're losing interest in, activities or hobbies that they used to really love, or they're withdrawing from family and friends, then there's an ongoing pattern of mood that seems to be emerging and getting in the way. So I think there is a way in which self-concept and children's ability to think about their own internal world can map onto how we can encourage them to think about their emotions and their mood and their mental health.
Can you talk a little bit about, we've talked about the difference between the capacity of adults around a particular child to do what they need versus, if they don't have as much capacity, how it's more likely that professional help will be needed sooner, and what you sort of see as the possibilities for improving that capacity, which I think would hopefully help to deal with the waiting list type problems.
Great point. Thank you. So in the program, we take that complexity where we were mapping the support that a child might need onto the mental health continuum one step further. And we say not only is the type of support the child needs related to their symptoms and their impact, but it's also about the capacity of the adults around them. So if the child is experiencing a mental health problem that's beginning to impact on them, but the adults around them don't have the capacity to provide that emotional literacy or to provide the scaffolding or supports that help the child better manage, then we step up the intervention. We go to the next level earlier before they move down the continuum. And that's important from an early intervention point of view. The earlier the adults are able to support a child to manage their emotions, to stop the impact of thoughts and feelings getting in the way, then we can move them back up the continuum. So there is, I think, a really important part around adult capacity, and we can't assume that it's always going to be there. One of the things I did want to touch on too, when we're talking about emotional literacy and emotion regulation, it's so easy to talk about and it's so hard to do. Managing your own emotions is a lifelong skill that lots of adults struggle with. And so the idea of just saying, oh, well, you can just label your child's emotions in the moment and they'll learn how to manage anger better, or they won't be as anxious anymore. It's like, we wish. They're really difficult skills, and it takes a lot of coaching and mentoring and support to get through those really strong emotions. And some kids just come out different and they have big feels. And how much they're going to need that support to manage their emotions is just going to be so much bigger and more intense than kids who just come out, just a bit more even keeled, a little bit more chill. And for some families, the emotion regulation piece is going to be much, much more challenging than others, even when there's capacity there to do so. So there's lots of different factors that go into how difficult or how easy that piece will be. And certainly we don't expect it to be necessarily really easy. It's something that takes time to invest in. So thank you.
It sort of touches on that, but I'm curious about to what extent do you think emotional literacy in parents and adults comes to them naturally versus having to work on it?
So to be controversial, Tony, our mentor, once heard someone quote, and I've tried to go back to the original source, I can't find it, but he says, the quote goes, parenting is to mental health what clean water is to the physical body. And I think that part of that quote is very stigmatizing and blaming of parents, because you can end up with a mental health problem while having fabulous parents, great parents. But then there's another part of it that is also true, in the sense that if you have an environment where you're being role modeled very difficult emotion regulation, high levels of anger, lots of, emotional outbursts, the chance that the child is going to be able to grow up and also manage those emotions is, really tiny. So we tend to learn a lot from what we see around us, but also the temperament that we're born with. And so for the kids who are more sensitive or have bigger emotions, the amount of modelling and support that they need to be able to manage those is even higher. And if they're the ones who end up in an environment where what they're seeing is also, not well regulated, then they're at even greater risk. I think that there is a big genetic component, but I also think there's a lot of environment and modeling in it too. So how much do kids just pop out with knowing their emotions and emotion literacy? It's a nature-nurture question. I think it's somewhere in the middle.
Thanks a lot. It was really interesting. And following up from that question, where do you see the interaction of the continuum with different cultural backgrounds, like the nurture and nature and the fact that, different societies that label things differently? And so how did you see the continuum interact in different communities?
Great question. One of the reasons that sat behind the continuum is that different cultures have different experiences and attitudes towards mental health and labeling mental health, and that can be a barrier to understanding, but it can also be a barrier to facilitating support. One of the questions of the participants in the Delphi study was, how can we choose language that is appropriate across as many different backgrounds as possible? And after we did the Delphi study, staff at MCRI actually did focus groups with different cultural backgrounds and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families as well. And what they found from that process was, as part of the Delphi study, we not only had those 4 labels, but we also had what we call descriptors underneath, where we would say, coping means that they're getting on okay, and overwhelmed means they're always distressed. And at the good end of the mental health continuum, there was the word resilient. And if I remember correctly in the focus groups, part of the feedback from First Nations was that for many of their communities, they can be overwhelmed but resilient. And so you need to take out that descriptor as you're only resilient if you have good mental health, because actually you can be faced with huge amounts of adversity and still be resilient even if you're overwhelmed. It just depends on your environment. And I think the same was true for different cultural backgrounds. They really took issue with the descriptors. And so MCRI actually took those away. If you look on their website, the printout that they give of the continuum doesn't have those descriptors in them. I think it's really difficult for adults without those descriptors to go to another adult and say, I think this child is struggling and these are the reasons why I think they sit there, without any kind of goalposts that say this is the struggling and overwhelmed are different by X, Y, and Z. And I think that's the part where we need culturally specific descriptors of what overwhelmed and what struggling and what coping and what good mental health. And that would overlay with expectations too. Different cultures, different families have different expectations of 5-year-olds versus 12-year-olds. So what looks like struggling in one culture may not look like struggling in another.
Thank you, Laura. Your talk has been amazing so far. My question is pertaining to, as you're increasing the emotional literacy of children, when you're dealing with children that have a great intelligence, that also have the ability to lie and manipulate, when do you sort of draw the line with believing what they're saying and calling them out on a lie?
Great points. So there is a diagnosis that's somewhat controversial that is called callous and unemotional traits. And this is a precursor to psychopathy in adults. So psychiatrists and mental health researchers don't like labeling children psychopaths, and so they call it callous and unemotional traits. But it's essentially the same thing. And what they find when studying these children is very high intelligence and the ability to understand that if they behave in a particular way or say things in a particular way, they'll get the outcome that they want. And that this happens at age inappropriate times compared to peers without this particular label or condition. It seems to be fairly strongly genetic, and it's probably similar to a neurodevelopmental disorder. And there needs to be a lot of emotion coaching for children who fall into this category. It's not my area of expertise though. So to be able to give you really specifics, I don't feel like I can do that, but I can say certainly there are instances where just increasing emotional literacy isn't going to be the panacea. It's not going to solve all problems. And for children who have, and I'm not saying these are the same things, but for children with autism spectrum disorder, they're not going to be able to have insight into other people's emotions to the same level as what their peers who are neurotypical are. And so emotion literacy needs to look different for neurodivergent children. Not the same thing, but I'm just saying that different. It's not always exactly the same the way we teach it for every single child. And certainly if there are children with really high intelligence but with these callous unemotional traits, it can be a different kettle of fish.
Thanks very much. Very interesting talk. Just on that last question, just to add to that and your answer, I'm curious about trauma response in children. How much of this is trauma response and how much are we talking about thoughts and feelings and behaviours that are a result of trauma?
Yeah, great. So I think one of the benefits of the mental health continuum is that it can incorporate where kids are struggling because of trauma without needing a diagnosis. And I think one of the failings of our school and health systems is that if children have experienced trauma but they don't have a diagnosis, it's hard to get them the support that they need at times. If we're able to go into a professional's office and say, this child is really overwhelmed, they are very distressed, we need support, I think that that's a motivator for action rather than, I think this child might have PTSD or I think this child might be depressed, and then you've got to, go through the hoops of getting that label. So I think it's actually very consistent with providing children with support. And we did a whole lot of Delphi studies to bring different experts together to look at how adults can best support children when a mental health problem is developing. And one of the Delphi studies we did, which was absolutely huge in terms of the content we put in there, was how adults can respond when a child has experienced an adverse event. And there were lots of different contexts in which we put different scenarios to our panels of experts. And it was things we did a whole lot of strategies around how you can help a child in the immediate aftermath of an event. So right there when you're at the scene, we did ones where you think, as an adult, you think that there's been abuse or neglect, but you're not sure and there hasn't been a disclosure. Things like how you respond after the death of a loved one, how you can manage ongoing adversity like poverty, racism, disadvantage, minority status, and how we can, as adults, respond to those issues. I absolutely think that there are ways in which children's mental health is impacted by the social world around them and by structural inequality. But I also think that there are ways in which adults can respond to behaviours that show a child is struggling without pathologizing or without needing to know everything about the trauma sitting behind that. So I think it's very consistent with being able to support kids who have experienced trauma.
What's one piece of advice you could give to the adults in this room to encourage the children in our lives to seek help, to self-regulate, to recognize what they're feeling?
I'd say try and do it yourself. We love that advice in the parenting research world, is that it's really hard to be a good role model if you're not doing it yourself. And it's hard. It's really hard. If you're not that good at it, you can't expect your child to be that good at it. And so it's a constant self-improvement, exercise to be trying to role model that for your kids. But also for anyone who works with kids, they don't need perfect. What they do need is being able to show up and say, I'm working on this. I didn't get that right. I'm really sorry. I lost my cool, or that I was, too emotional. Next time I'm going to try better. And so it's not about being perfect all the time. It's about giving it a go.
Thank you for listening to the podcast series of Raising the Bar Melbourne, a special health edition. If you want to listen to more Raising the Bar talks, head to rtbevent.com/podcasts.